Why did no one notice the way she carried herself? In the corner of the briefing room, the young woman sat with her hands folded on the table, her posture straight but quiet. Her boots touched the floor lightly, her shoulders squared, but she didn't push forward the way the others did. She didn't demand to be seen, and so they didn't. The voices in the room grew louder as maps were spread across the table, as commanders pointed at routes and contingencies. Men leaned in, eager to prove they had something to offer, but she just listened. Listening had always been her weapon. Silence had always been her shield. Still, one man at the table did notice. He looked across the room and caught the subtle flicker in her eyes, sharp, calculating, yet contained. He didn't say anything, not yet. Outside the walls of that sterile room, the world was already burning. A convoy had been ambushed days before. Civilians had gone missing. And somewhere in the chaos was the reason she had said yes to this mission when her instincts told her to walk away. But no one here knew that, not yet. Her name was Captain Elena Marlowe. Though names in her line of work mattered less than the shadows they carried. She didn't crave recognition, but she remembered the sting of being dismissed, again and again, in the early days, when her male counterparts had mistaken her silence for weakness, when her measured answers were brushed aside as hesitation, until one day her rifle spoke for her, delivering an impossible shot that ended a hostage standoff in seconds. The disbelief on their faces that day had been louder than any cheer. And yet, even after that, she never raised her voice. Now, sitting in this room, Elena's thoughts drifted far from the table's noise. She saw her mother's hands, fragile from years of working double shifts, folded around a letter she had never wanted her daughter to write. A letter written just in case. She saw the framed picture of her brother, gone too soon, his laugh still echoing in her memory. He had worn the uniform first. He had taught her how to stand straight, how to serve, how to believe that dignity meant more than survival. That promise, the one she made at his graveside, was why she was here now, why her steps carried not just duty but fire. The man at the table, the only one watching her, finally spoke. "Marlowe," he said, his voice cut through the noise. "You've been quiet, what's your read?" The room stilled, heads turned. Elena lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his. She didn't rush her words. She never did. "The pattern isn't about the ambush itself," she said evenly. "It's about where they forced the convoy to stop. Look at the terrain. They didn't pick that spot by accident. They wanted us to see the attack, to draw us in, which means this," her finger tapped the map lightly, "was never the real target." Silence. The commander leaned closer, his brow furrowed. And for the first time that morning, every voice in the room stopped to listen. They watched her hand linger on the map. No flourish, no arrogance, just a simple point that changed the weight of the conversation. Someone scribbled notes quickly. Another officer's expression hardened as if realizing she might be right. Still, there were always doubters. "That's one interpretation," someone said, half dismissive, half defensive. "But we don't have confirmation." Elena didn't argue. She only said, "No, we don't, but look again, you'll see it." The meeting wound down. Orders were given, strategies set in motion. Yet the echo of her words hung in the air longer than anyone admitted. Later, as they filed out of the briefing, one of the younger operators muttered under his breath, "Didn't think she had it in her." Elena heard it. She always heard it. She didn't flinch. She didn't correct him. She only adjusted her pack and walked past, her steps unhurried. Because what weighed on her was not his doubt, but the memory of something she had chosen not to tell them, something that pressed like a stone against her chest. Somewhere near the ambush site was a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years, a name tied to her brother, a name tied to a promise she still hadn't fulfilled. And if she found it, if she faced it, it could change everything. But they didn't need to know that, not yet. The desert air outside was sharp with dust, stinging the throat. Helicopters thundered in the distance, blades whipping the heat into restless currents. Elena stood alone for a moment, her hand resting on the strap of her rifle, eyes narrowing against the horizon. She could already feel the unease threading through her chest. Not fear. She knew fear well enough to recognize it. This was something different, the weight of unfinished business. "Captain." The voice behind her was steady, almost casual. It belonged to Major Halston, the one who had called on her in the briefing. He was older, seasoned, with the kind of scars that didn't always show on skin. "You're not wrong," he said quietly, "about the ambush." Elena turned slightly, studying him. He lowered his voice. "But you weren't telling them everything, were you?" Her silence answered for her. Halston didn't press. He just nodded once, as if he understood more than he let on. Then he walked away, leaving her with the hum of engines and the endless horizon stretching before her. She watched him go. Part of her wondered if he had seen through her because he carried his own ghosts. But there was no time to unravel that. The mission clock was ticking. That night before deployment, she sat alone in her tent. The others laughed somewhere nearby, trading stories, trying to keep the edge of nerves at bay. But Elena couldn't join them. She unfolded a letter, edges worn from being opened too many times. Her brother's handwriting stared back at her, sharp, bold, alive on paper even though he was gone. "You'll walk this road one day, Lena," it read. "And when you do, remember, strength isn't about being loud. It's about carrying fire quietly so others can find their way in the dark." Her throat tightened. She folded the letter back with care. Outside, the desert wind shifted. A storm was brewing. And with it, a mission that would test not just her skill, but the very promise she had lived by. Sleep never came easy before a mission. She lay on her cot staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to the distant growl of machinery, the muffled laughter of her team. Somewhere, a radio hissed with static. The night pressed in heavy. Memories bled into the silence. Her brother's voice calling her by the nickname only he used. The day he left and never returned. The folded flag handed to her mother's trembling hands. Elena had stood like stone that day, refusing to break. But inside, something had cracked. She had promised then that she would finish what he started, though she hadn't even known what that meant yet. And now, with this mission, she thought she might be closer to finding out. The base lights flickered under the push of the storm winds. She rose, pulled on her jacket, and stepped outside. Sand whipped against her skin, the air dry and restless. A mechanic cursed somewhere near the motor pool as tarps flapped and snapped. Elena breathed it in, letting the chaos settle her. The desert had a way of stripping people down to their bones. Out here, titles didn't matter. Rank didn't shield you. Out here, it was you and your choices, raw and unpolished. She stood until the wind stung her eyes, then turned back inside. Dawn came harsh and unforgiving. The team gathered near the aircraft, blades thundering overhead, gear clanking, boots crunching against gravel. Jokes were tossed around, thin veils over nerves. Elena checked her rifle in silence. One of the younger soldiers, Morales, glanced at her. "You don't talk much, do you?" he asked, half grinning. She looked at him, then at the rifle in her hands. "Talking doesn't stop bullets," she said simply. He smirked, but his eyes flickered with a trace of respect. Halston passed by, giving her a brief nod. It was small, almost invisible. But to Elena it felt like acknowledgement, like someone finally had seen her fire, even if she carried it quietly. As they boarded, she cast one last glance at the horizon. Dust swirled, engines roared, and the storm still loomed distant but inevitable. Her brother's words echoed once more. Quiet fire, service, country. And as the aircraft lifted into the pale sky, Elena knew this mission would not just test her skill, it would test her silence, her resilience, her promise. Because somewhere beyond the dunes, her past was waiting, and it would not stay hidden forever. The helicopter's blades tore through the dawn, chopping the desert silence into restless fragments. The roar was deafening, yet inside the cabin, a strange quiet held. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, rifles resting across their laps, eyes fixed on the floor or the horizon. Each man carried nerves in his own way. Some chewed gum until their jaws ached. Some muttered small prayers, lips barely moving. Some stared blankly, trying to picture home instead of what lay ahead. Elena sat among them, silent as ever. Her hands rested lightly on her rifle, but her mind was nowhere near the steel and sand. Her thoughts were with her brother. She remembered his face, that boyish grin that seemed to defy gravity, even in the harshest days. She remembered the way he teased her when she first fired a rifle, pretending to wince at the recoil she had barely felt. He had been her compass, her anchor. And when he fell, she had lost not just a sibling, but her reason for staying in the safe shadows of life. The memory pressed heavy on her chest, almost louder than the rotor blades. She tightened her grip on the rifle. The others didn't need to see the fire that smoldered beneath her calm. 30 mics, the crew chief shouted over the engine noise. Halston leaned forward, his eyes cutting across the cabin, scanning faces like a man counting cards he couldn't afford to lose. His gaze lingered on Elena for just a second before moving on. He never asked. He never needed to. One of the younger soldiers, Morales, broke the silence. His voice was a little too loud, a little too eager. "You know, first time I flew into this kind of op, I swore the bird was shaking harder than my hands." A couple of men chuckled. It was forced, but it helped. Elena almost smiled, almost. She glanced at Morales, saw the nervous energy in his leg bouncing against the steel floor. He was young, younger than her brother had been when he deployed. "Keep your hands steady when it counts," she said. Her voice calm, low, carried just enough to reach him. Morales met her eyes, startled. Then he nodded. His legs stopped bouncing. Outside, the desert stretched endless. The sun clawed higher, throwing sharp angles across ridges and valleys. The pilot's voice crackled over comms, reporting turbulence from the incoming storm. Sand whipped through the air, turning the horizon into a blurred veil. Elena leaned back, shutting her eyes for a brief moment. The storm reminded her of another mission, years ago, when she had been pinned down with nothing but the hiss of the wind and the rattle of gunfire around her. She had thought she would die there. She hadn't, but a piece of her innocence had. She opened her eyes again. The helicopter dipped suddenly. Shouts rippled through the cabin. The crew chief steadied himself, barking reassurance. "Hold on, crosswinds from the storm." Elena barely moved. Her calm unsettled some of the men, but she wasn't trying to prove anything. She just knew storms. The desert tested you, stripped you bare. If you panicked, it consumed you. If you listened, it guided you. The bird steadied. Then in the distance, smoke. Dark, thick, curling against the pale sky like a warning. "LZ in sight," the pilot said. They came in hard, fast. Dust exploded beneath them as the helicopter touched down, swallowing everything in a choking haze. Boots hit the ground, packs shifted, orders barked through muffled comms. Elena moved with precision, unhurried but never slow, her rifle raised, eyes scanning the ridges. The air reeked of burning fuel. Somewhere beyond the LZ, an engine crackled, metal twisted under heat. The convoy ambush had left scars here, blackened earth, shredded tires, shattered glass. But Elena's eyes weren't on the wreckage. They were on the terrain beyond it. She could feel it. The silence wasn't natural. Halston joined her, his rifle raised. "Thoughts?" She answered with a question. "Why stage an ambush and leave it open like this?" He nodded slowly, his jaw tight. The team spread out, checking the vehicles. A few muttered curses at the carnage. No bodies, just traces, bloodstains on the sand, drag marks leading away. Civilians had been taken. That much was clear. Morales called out, "Tracks lead north, sir. Multiple footprints, heavy loads." The commander in charge gave the order to move. And so they did. Hours blurred into heat and silence, boots crunching against sand, the storm edging closer with every step. The desert tested their lungs, their resolve. Elena kept to the rear flank, her eyes sweeping, listening to the silence between footsteps. Her instincts clawed at her. Something about this trail wasn't right. But she said nothing, not yet. It wasn't until they crested a ridge that the truth hit. Below, tucked between stone outcroppings, was not a hideout but bait. Scattered supplies, a few abandoned crates, a smoldering fire. Too obvious, too placed. Elena froze. "Hold," she whispered into comms, sharper than usual. The team halted, rifles raising. Halston turned to her. "What is it?" She scanned the rocks, the angles, the shadows. And then she saw it. A glint, faint but unmistakable, just above the ridge opposite. "Sniper." "Up high left ridge," she said, already shifting, steadying her rifle. The crack came a second later. A bullet hissed past, biting the sand near Morales's boots. He cursed, stumbling back. Shouts filled comms. Men dove for cover. Elena didn't flinch. She exhaled slow, squeezed, and her shot rang out. The glint vanished. Silence fell again. But the silence didn't comfort her. It meant there were more. Gunfire erupted, echoing across the canyon. Dust kicked up, the storm winds carrying the sound in fractured bursts. The team returned fire, scattered, pinned. Elena stayed low, her breath even, her rifle a natural extension of her heartbeat. She picked her targets carefully, not wasting a single shot. Each pull of the trigger was measured, deliberate, her silence carrying into the storm through the language of precision. She heard Morales shouting somewhere to her right, fear in his voice. She shifted, covering him, her bullet cutting down the figure moving on his flank. His voice on comms cracked. "I thanks, Captain." But Elena barely registered it. Her focus was razor-sharp. Amid the chaos, her mind drifted again, unwanted, intrusive to her brother. She had once promised him she wouldn't let silence kill her, that she wouldn't disappear into the background of her own life. Yet here she was, unseen even by those she bled beside. Still, maybe being unseen was what kept her alive. Minutes dragged, then the gunfire thinned, shouts faded, the canyon settled into uneasy quiet once more. The commander signaled regroup. The team moved cautiously, weapons raised, checking bodies, clearing angles. Halston approached Elena. His face was unreadable, but his eyes carried something close to respect. "Your call saved us from walking straight into it." She only nodded. But inside she felt the old ache again, because this wasn't just about the mission. Somewhere in this desert she was chasing more than an objective. She was chasing her brother's ghost. And the trail was only beginning. As they pressed deeper into the canyon, Morales drew closer to her, his voice low. "How did you know about the sniper?" Elena glanced at him. "You don't look for what's there, you look for what shouldn't be." He nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. She saw the fear still lingering in his eyes, but also a flicker of something else. Trust. The storm clouds thickened overhead, blotting out the sun. Wind howled through the rocks, carrying sand that stung the skin. Radios crackled with static. Every step grew heavier. But Elena didn't falter. Her brother's words stayed with her. Quiet fire, silent promise. Somewhere ahead, civilians were waiting. Somewhere ahead, answers lay buried. And she would walk until she found both. The first shot of quiet after battle always felt heavier than the bullets themselves. The canyon was still now, littered with brass casings and the faint smell of burned powder. Bodies lay where they had fallen, scattered like broken shadows against the rocks. The wind picked up sand, dragging it across the ground as if trying to cover the traces of violence. Elena crouched by a fallen insurgent, her gloved hand brushing over the pouch strapped to his vest. Ammunition, maps, scraps of paper with coordinates scribbled in haste. She tucked them away without a word. Every fragment mattered. But what caught her attention wasn't on the body, it was the ridge itself. The position, the vantage point. Whoever had set up here knew more than just the terrain. They knew the rhythm of American patrols. They knew exactly when and where to stage their trap. Her jaw tightened. This wasn't random. "Captain," Morales said, his voice shaky but steadier than it had been earlier. "You think they're working with someone, feeding them intel?" Elena didn't answer immediately. She looked past him, scanning the horizon. A storm wall loomed there, its gray belly stretched wide across the desert, ready to swallow the land whole. Finally, she said, "Maybe, or maybe they've just learned us too well." The younger soldier nodded, though the unease in his eyes deepened. Halston came over, kneeling beside her. He studied the scraps she'd found, his brow furrowed. They weren't just holding this ground, they were waiting. "For us," Elena added. Halston's silence confirmed it. The commander gave orders to keep moving, but slower now, tighter. The canyon funneled them north, each step dragging grit into their boots, every echo bouncing too loud off the stone. The storm above swallowed the sun whole, leaving the sky bruised with shifting gray. As they moved, Elena's mind tugged at something, an itch, a thread left dangling. The maps, the placement, the precision. None of it lined up with the crude tactics she'd seen before in this region. It felt familiar, almost deliberate. And beneath that familiarity, a fear stirred. She didn't share it, not yet. The trail twisted. A ravine yawned open to their left, a scar in the earth that swallowed sound. Morales peered down, muttering, "Feels like the desert's holding its breath." Elena said nothing, but she felt it too. They reached a narrow choke point where the walls pressed close, barely wide enough for two men shoulder to shoulder. The team paused, rifles raised, scanning the shadows. Elena's heart beat slower here, as it always did before moments like this. Her breathing matched it, calm, deliberate. Fear sharpened senses. Panic dulled them. She had learned that truth young, long before the uniform, long before the rifle. The first explosion came sudden, ripping the silence apart. The ground shook, dust rained down, shouts filled the comms. An IED had been buried along the ridge wall, triggered just as the point man passed. He went down hard, his cry cut short. Smoke billowed, choking. The canyon became chaos. Elena dropped low, dragging Morales back by his vest as gunfire erupted again from hidden positions above. Echoes made it impossible to count how many. It didn't matter. Too many. Pinned. Her mind raced, but her movement stayed measured. She shifted, found cover against a jagged boulder, and laid suppressing fire. Bullets cracked past, sparking stone. "Down, stay down," Halston barked, his voice somehow steady in the storm of sound. Elena crawled closer to the injured point man. Blood pooled fast, his breaths ragged. He reached for her wrist, eyes wide, pleading. She pressed her hand firm against the wound, her jaw clenched. "Stay with me," she whispered, though she knew the odds. Around them the firefight raged. Morales froze, fumbling with his rifle. Panic had him by the throat. Elena's voice cut through. "Morales, focus." He jerked his head toward her, saw the steadiness in her eyes, and something clicked. His hands steadied, his shots found rhythm. But still they were cornered. Halston crawled over, his shoulder grazed by a bullet, blood streaking down his sleeve. "We can't stay here," he said, low, urgent. Elena nodded. She scanned the ridge again. And there, through the smoke, through the chaos, she saw it. A gap in the enemy's fire, a weakness in their pattern. "They're forcing us right," she said. Halston followed her gaze. His eyes narrowed, then widened with realization. "You're sure?" "Yes." He didn't question her further. That was something she noticed about him. Others doubted her silence. He trusted it. Orders went out. The team shifted, moving low and fast, dragging the injured, covering each other with bursts of fire. Bullets chased them, biting stone, but the gap held. And then they were through. The canyon opened into a wider basin, rough ground scattered with thorn brush and broken rock. Cover, at least. They scrambled in, breaths heaving, rifles raised. The gunfire behind them slowed, then stopped. Whoever had staged the trap didn't follow. That silence again, heavy, watching. The medic worked on the wounded point man. His chances were thin, but no one said it. The men's faces told enough. Elena stood apart, her rifle still raised toward the canyon mouth. Her body was steady, but inside, the fear she had buried for years clawed its way up. Because she had seen that tactic before. The placement of explosives, the feigned gaps in fire, the luring into choke points. It wasn't random, it wasn't common. It belonged to someone. Someone she had once known. Her chest tightened, the storm winds whipping dust into her eyes. She blinked hard, but it wasn't the grit that burned. Halston came to her side, his breathing ragged but controlled. "Something on your mind?" Elena didn't answer. "You've seen this before," he pressed, his tone more observation than question. Her silence was all the confirmation he needed. He didn't push further. He just looked at her, searching, then said quietly, "When the time comes, I'll need the truth, all of it." Then he walked away, leaving her with the weight of his words and the storm pressing closer. The men settled into the basin, nervous eyes flicking between the medic and the canyon. Morale sat near her, helmet tilted back, his face pale under the grit. "Captain," he said, his voice breaking softer this time, do we even make it out of here?" Elena looked at him, really looked, his youth, his fear, his hope fragile and desperate. She wanted to tell him yes, wanted to tell him that every step they took meant survival, but lies didn't belong here, not in the desert, not in war. "You keep moving," she said instead. "One step, then another, that's how you make it out." He swallowed hard, then nodded. The storm broke overhead, the sky tearing open with rain and sand mixed in brutal tandem. Visibility dropped to feet. The earth turned slick mud mixing with blood. Radios hissed static, useless. They were cut off. The commander gathered them, shouting over the howl of the wind. They had two choices: dig in and hope for extraction after the storm, or push forward blindly into terrain that might hold more traps. Eyes turned to Halston, then slowly to Elena. She felt their gaze, heavy, expectant. For once her silence wasn't enough. Her heart pounded. Her brother's words echoed, "Carry fire quietly so others can find their way in the dark." She exhaled. "We move," she said. And the decision was made. They shouldered their packs, tightened grips on rifles, and stepped into the storm. The desert swallowed them whole, wind shrieking, sand clawing at their skin. Elena led, quiet steps, quiet fire. But in her chest, a question burned louder than the storm. If the tactics were his, if the shadow she feared was really here, what would she do when she found him? The storm swallowed sound. What had been a battlefield just minutes ago was now reduced to a blur of gray-brown haze, where even the man at your shoulder looked like a fatting shadow. The desert wind howled like some ancient beast, carrying shards of sand that stung skin and bit through cloth. Boots sank into mud that hadn't existed an hour before. Every step forward was a battle of its own. Elena led, not by orders shouted into radios, those had died in the static when the storm rose, but by presence. She moved with steady, deliberate steps, rifle angled down but ready, every muscle tuned to the shifting threat in the unseen. Behind her the team followed, shapes hunched under the weight of gear, their forms ghost-like in the blinding grit. Halston moved second, his silhouette solid, unflinching, the tether between her and the others. Morale stumbled but kept on, his breathing rough in the moments when the wind eased enough to hear. The medic carried the wounded point man across his back, staggering but refusing to give way. They weren't just fighting the storm, they were fighting themselves. Each man carried the question unspoken: would they even make it through the night? Elena didn't ask the question, she already knew the answer. It wasn't guaranteed, it never had been. But survival was never promised by certainty. It was carved out of grit, decision by decision, step by step. The ground rose into jagged ridges, forcing them into a narrow path. Elena raised a fist, halting the column. Shapes shifted behind her, rifles raising into ready angles despite the storm. They couldn't see 20 feet ahead, but instinct spoke louder than sight. Something was there. The storm pressed harder, sand pelting their faces, but Elena's breathing slowed. She adjusted her grip on the rifle, eyes narrowing against the blur. A shadow flickered across the path ahead. Then another. Too quick, too precise for the storm's tricks. Ambush. The first gunshot cracked through the roar of the wind, and chaos exploded again. Bullets whipped through the sand, tracers' faint streaks of fire swallowed almost instantly by the storm. Muzzle flashes flared and died, giving glimpses of figures moving in the haze, enemies positioned to choke them off. Elena dropped to a knee, returning fire with short, deliberate bursts. Each shot was calculated, measured. She wasn't wasting rounds. Halston moved to her side, shouting something she couldn't hear over the storm's roar, but she read his gestures. They were pinned. Again. The storm that should have been their shield had become a cage. Morales nearly panicked, firing blindly into the haze. Elena's hand snapped out, gripping his arm tight. She locked eyes with him, her expression fierce, unyielding. His breathing steadied. He aimed slower this time, tighter. His rounds found rhythm instead of panic. The medic dropped the wounded man into the shelter of a shallow depression and pulled his own weapon, firing low and wide to keep heads down. The team fought, grit grinding in their teeth, vision blurred, the storm cutting away every advantage they thought they had. And then, in the flicker of muzzle light, Elena saw it again. A tactic too precise, a placement too calculated, enemies shifting like they had studied her team's movements before they even stepped into the canyon. Her chest tightened. It wasn't just an enemy force, it was him. The ghost she hadn't named aloud, the shadow from her past, the one who had taught her silence and patience in combat long before she had worn the flag on her shoulder. Now, it seemed, he was teaching those lessons to others, men trying to kill her. The thought burned like fire in her ribs, but she couldn't let it consume her. Not now. Left flank. Halston's voice finally punched through, carried on a break in the wind. Elena shifted instantly, covering the angle, cutting down two figures who tried to circle close. The team pressed forward, crawling, stumbling, firing in bursts. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't clean. It was survival, raw and jagged. Minutes stretched like hours until, finally, the gunfire thinned. Shadows melted back into the storm. The silence that followed was jagged, uneasy. They had survived, again. But not without cost. Two men were down, one permanently, one breathing shallow with blood staining the sand beneath him. The medic worked frantically, but no one asked the question they all carried. Would reinforcements even come through this storm? Or would their effort be for nothing? Elena crouched by a boulder, chest heaving. Her rifle rested against her leg, her hand still tight on the grip. She closed her eyes against the sting of the storm, against the weight in her chest. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was something more dangerous. It was personal. Halston came to her side, his face streaked with grit, his eyes searching hers. "You knew it, didn't you? That ambush pattern, the way they moved, that wasn't random." Elena didn't answer. "You've seen it before," he pressed. Her silence wasn't just reluctance. It was fear of what speaking the truth would mean. Halston leaned closer, lowering his voice though the storm swallowed sound. "Who is he?" Her eyes snapped open. His question wasn't if, it was who. She looked at him, her face unreadable, then turned her gaze back into the storm. For a moment she thought of telling him, of saying the name she hadn't spoken in years, a name tied to blood and betrayal, to choices that had carved scars deeper than bullets. But she swallowed it back. "Later," she said. Her voice was low, steady. Halston studied her, then gave a slow nod. He didn't push further, not yet. The commander's voice cut through, sharp, decisive. They would keep moving, find higher ground, try to get a signal through the storm. The men rallied, their faces hollow but determined. They had no choice. Elena rose, slinging her rifle, her body aching but her step steady. She took point again, the storm clawing at her mind burning with the truth she hadn't spoken. Every step forward dragged her closer to the confrontation she couldn't avoid. Because the storm wasn't their only enemy. Somewhere out there in the same storm, on the same battlefield, moved the ghost of her past, a man who had once been her brother-in-arms, a man she had once trusted. Now he was the one setting the traps that threatened to bury them all. And when their paths crossed again, silence would not be enough. The storm broke without warning. One moment the desert raged like a living thing, wind clawing at their bodies, sand searing every inch of skin. The next, it staggered, slowed, and then, with the abruptness of a curtain tearing down, the fury gave way to silence. The team stood still, blinking against the sudden clarity. Above them, the night sky revealed itself piece by piece, stars burning faint through the thinning haze. The moon hung low, pale and indifferent. The ground, once a blur of grit, stretched out in fractured ridges and shadowed gullies. Every shape felt alien after hours of blindness. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Elena could see her own hand again. She flexed her fingers against the rifle's grip, the leather of her gloves cracked with sand. "Higher ground," the commander ordered. His voice was hoarse, like the storm had scraped it raw. They moved uphill, the incline punishing, gear dragging them backward with every step. The medic and Morales carried the wounded man between them, his breaths ragged, blood still seeping despite the bandages. Every few steps he groaned, a sound that cut through the silence sharper than gunfire. No one spoke, not yet. At the ridge, the world opened into a plateau, a flat stretch of stone carved by ancient winds, with jagged outcrops that gave shelter from distant eyes. From here, the desert spread below them like an endless sea, dark waves of sand and stone, shifting and unforgiving. The commander called a halt. The team collapsed into rough circles, dropping their packs, checking weapons. No fire, no lights, just darkness, broken only by the cold glow of the stars. Elena sat apart, her back against a stone, her rifle across her knees. Her chest rose and fell in slow, controlled breaths, but inside her pulse hammered. Halston sat down across from her. His eyes never left her face. She tried to ignore him, but his silence pressed harder than words. Finally, she met his gaze. "You want to know," she said. Halston nodded. "I need to know, we all do. Those tactics, that ambush, it wasn't luck. They were trained like us." Her throat tightened. "Not like us," she whispered, "by me." Halston didn't flinch, but his eyes darkened. The others nearby shifted subtly, their ears tuned. No one spoke, but the circle of silence grew heavy. Elena drew in a slow breath, her voice low, steady. "Years ago, before I wore this flag, I was sent to work with a unit off the books. We trained local fighters, gave them skills, discipline, tools to defend their own. It was supposed to be clean, controlled." Her eyes drifted, unfocused, as memory pulled her backward. But one of them he learned faster than anyone else, smarter, quieter. He absorbed everything I taught: marksmanship, movement, silence. He called me sister, said I gave him purpose. Her voice faltered, the weight of the word pressing into her chest. He was more than just a student. He was a friend, family almost. The silence stretched. The wind whispered across the ridge. "What happened?" Halston asked softly. Elena's jaw tightened. He turned. Whether it was ideology, power, or betrayal, I don't know. He used what I gave him, built his own circle, his own army. Every lesson I taught, he twisted. And when the time came, he didn't just walk away. He made sure I saw the bodies he left behind. People I trusted, people I couldn't save. Her hands clenched against the rifle, knuckles white. I thought I'd buried that ghost, but tonight I saw him in the ambush. The spacing, the fire control, that wasn't chance. That was his hand guiding them. The men absorbed her words in silence. Some shifted uncomfortably, others stared at the ground. Morales looked away, his jaw working as though chewing on something bitter. Finally, the commander spoke. His voice was flat. "You trained the man who's trying to kill us now." Elena's chest ached. "Yes." The commander's eyes cut into her, hard and unyielding. "And you didn't tell us sooner." Her gaze met his. "Would you have listened, or would you have pulled me off this mission before we even stepped into this canyon?" The commander didn't answer. His silence said enough. Halston broke it instead. "She saved us back there. Morales would have panicked. I'd be dead without her cover. She recognized the pattern before any of us." His defense hung in the air, sharp, unasked for but true. The medic, still working over the wounded man, added without looking up, "We don't have the luxury of blame. Not now. We just have to survive the night." The group fell into uneasy quiet. The weight of what Elena had revealed hung over them like the desert's cold night sky. She leaned back against the stone, her eyes on the stars. The guilt pressed heavy. Every lesson she had once taught now hunted her in the dark, but under it, deeper, there was something else. Resolve. This wasn't just survival anymore, it was reckoning. Halston shifted closer, his voice low so only she could hear. "What's his name?" Her lips barely moved. "Karim." The name bled out like poison. Halston studied her face, then nodded once. "Then we find him." Her eyes flicked to his. "You don't understand. He won't come at us straight. He'll bleed us out, cut us down piece by piece. That's how he wins. That's what I taught him." "Then you know how to stop him." Her chest rose, fell. "Maybe, but it'll cost us." Halston didn't argue. His silence carried its own weight. The night stretched long. They ate in silence, cold rations chewed without taste. The medic's hands never stopped, trying to hold life in the wounded man. Morales sat with his head in his hands, rocking slightly, whispering something under his breath no one else could hear. Elena kept watch, eyes scanning the ridges below, every shadow a threat. The desert seemed quiet now, almost too quiet. But she knew better. Karim was out there, watching, waiting. And somewhere inside her, beneath the layers of guilt and fear, a fire burned. Not loud, not bright, but quiet, steady. The same fire that had carried her through every silence, every loss, every promise of service she had ever sworn. She didn't speak it aloud. She didn't have to. The fire walked with her. And soon it would meet his shadow head-on. The desert was too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as though holding its breath. The storm had blown itself out, but it left behind an emptiness that gnawed at the senses. Every sound, a boot against stone, a weapon's strap shifting, felt louder than it should have. Elena crouched at the edge of the ridge, eyes on the world below. From here the desert stretched endless, silvered by the moonlight, broken only by shadowed valleys and jagged rock. It looked calm. It looked still. It was a lie. Karim was out there, somewhere. She could feel him in the silence like a weight pressing against her chest. Behind her the team huddled, small shapes against the rock, their breaths visible in the night air. The wounded man clung to life by threads, the medic's hands stained with blood that refused to stop. Morales rocked quietly again, muttering prayers or curses, she couldn't tell which. Halston stood apart, watching her. He didn't speak, but his silence carried meaning. He was waiting for her to lead. The commander paced. He looked smaller now, hunched against the cold, his voice grating when he finally spoke. "We can't sit here. We're burning daylight we don't have." Elena didn't turn. "We move now, we walk into him. That's what he wants." "You trained him," the commander snapped. "So tell us, what does he want?" Her jaw clenched. She forced her breathing slow. "He wants fear. He wants us second-guessing every shadow until we break apart. He doesn't have to win a fight, he just has to make us lose ourselves. The commander's glare hardened. Then we don't give him the chance. We press forward, push through the canyon before dawn. The silence that followed wasn't agreement. It was exhaustion, doubt. Elena finally turned. Her voice cut clean through the air. If we move now, half of us won't make it to the canyon. He's waiting for us there. He'll choke us in the bottleneck. That's his pattern. The men shifted, their eyes flicking between her and the commander. For the first time, the unspoken question surfaced. Who was really leading them? The commander's face burned with frustration, but before he could snap again, Halston stepped forward. She's right. His tone was calm, firm. I've seen ambushes, I've seen setups. That canyon, a coffin if we walk it now. The commander's silence was thick. He knew it too, but yielding felt like weakness, and weakness in front of his men was poison. Elena didn't press further. She didn't have to. The men were already listening, not to rank but to survival. The medic looked up, his face gaunt. We need time. If we push the wounded through that terrain, he won't make it. Elena gave a slow nod. We hold. Find high cover, make them come to us. If Karim wants us bleeding in the dark, we make him bleed first. Her voice carried quiet conviction, not forceful, not loud, just steady enough that it sank into the men's bones. The commander looked away, jaw tight, but he didn't argue. They shifted positions, moving deeper into the rocks. A defensive circle, watch rotations, low profile. The silence stretched, broken only by shallow breaths and the occasional crack of settling stone. Hours passed like days. Elena stayed awake, her eyes sweeping the horizon, her ears tuned to the smallest sound. Every creak of gear, every cough from the wounded, every whisper of wind. She carried it all in her chest. And beneath it, she felt the old conflict tearing inside her. She had given Karim the tools to hunt them. She had built this storm with her own hands, years ago, thinking she was serving something greater. Now it was her men bleeding under its weight. The guilt pressed harder than the desert's cold. But guilt alone wouldn't save them. When the first shot came, it didn't surprise her. It snapped across the ridge, sharp, controlled. A man cried out, dropping with a hole in his shoulder. The medic cursed, dragging him down behind cover. Shadows stirred in the distance, too far to see clearly, too precise to be random. Karim had come. Elena dropped flat, rifle braced, her eyes narrowing through the scope. A flicker of movement there just past the ridge. She squeezed the trigger. One shadow folded. But the others didn't break. They pressed forward, silent, disciplined, not reckless fighters, soldiers, her soldiers. The firefight lit the night in bursts. Muzzle flashes strobed across stone. Men shouted, cursed, screamed. The medic's hands never stopped moving, blood slick under the moon. Morales wept quietly as he fired, his voice shaking with each shot. Elena moved like steel, calm, controlled. Her shots were deliberate, each one counted. She didn't let her pulse dictate her rifle. She dictated her rifle. But even as she fought, her chest burned. Every enemy she dropped felt like killing her own past. Minutes stretched, the assault wavered, then broke. Silence returned, jagged and raw. The men sagged against stone, panting, bleeding. One more wounded, another gone. The circle was shrinking. Elena lowered her rifle, her breath steady despite the ache in her limbs. She scanned the horizon, but Karim was gone again, like smoke. Halston slid down beside her, his face streaked with grime. He's testing us. She nodded once, me more than you. Halston studied her profile, the hard line of her jaw. You think he'll come himself? Her eyes stayed on the horizon. He'll come, he always does, but not until he thinks I'm broken. Halston was quiet for a long moment, then softly, and are you? Her lips curved, not into a smile, but something darker. Not yet. The medic's voice carried across the circle. He won't last the night. he said, nodding to the wounded man. "If we can't evac, he's gone." The commander looked at Elena again, his eyes hollow, pride cracked. "You have a plan." Her silence lasted a beat too long. Then she nodded once. "We don't wait for him to bleed us out," she said. "We draw him, force him to reveal himself." Halston's brow furrowed. "Bait." Her gaze didn't waver. "Me." The air tightened. Even the desert seemed to hold still. The commander started to protest but stopped. He saw it too. There wasn't another option. Karim wanted her. He always had. Halston's jaw worked. He didn't like it, but he didn't argue. The men looked at her differently now, not as a soldier beside them but as something heavier, a choice, a sacrifice. Elena didn't meet their eyes. She didn't need their approval. She only needed their readiness. The night grew colder. The stars burned harder. And somewhere in the shadows, Karim waited. For her. She closed her eyes for a moment, her chest rising, falling. The weight pressed heavy, but beneath it, that same quiet fire burned steady. She would walk into his shadow, not for glory, not for absolution, but for them. Because service wasn't always about survival. Sometimes it was about standing in the dark so others could walk into the light. Her fingers tightened on the rifle. And in the silence of the desert, she promised herself one thing. When the time came, she would not falter. Not again. The world narrowed to silence. Her breath was shallow, caught in the hollow of her chest as if sound itself might betray them. Dust floated in thin beams of moonlight seeping through cracks in the ceiling above, every particle suspended, every second stretched. She could hear the hum of the generator outside, faint, almost drowned by the weight of her own heartbeat. Emily crouched low, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. The room smelled of iron, of sweat, of a fear that clung to men who had sat here waiting for dawn, not knowing if it would arrive. She glanced to her left. Sergeant Cruz's jaw was locked tight, his hand gripping the stock of his rifle like it was a lifeline. Across from them, Lieutenant Kane whispered something under his breath, half a prayer, half a curse. No one moved, no one dared. Because just beyond that broken wooden door, footsteps had stopped. They weren't friendly. They weren't random. Whoever was out there was listening. Emily closed her eyes for half a second. She thought of her father again, the night he had told her that silence was its own kind of weapon. He had been right, but silence was also a test, and right now it was stretching them thin like glass ready to shatter. Then, a creak, the door shuttered under a hand. Kane's rifle twitched upward, Cruz's breathing deepened. Emily lifted her hand, a single motion of command, steady, firm. They froze. The door didn't open, not yet. Whoever stood out there hesitated as though aware that danger lived on the other side. A pause, a retreat of weight, then retreating steps. Gone. For now. Only then did Cruz exhale. It was almost a growl of relief. Kane leaned his head back against the wall and whispered, "They're testing us." Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. They all knew. The enemy wasn't rushing in. They were waiting, probing, circling like wolves, ready to wear them down until exhaustion broke their edge. And that was the real danger time. Hours blurred. The night dragged with the weight of uncertainty. Sometimes Emily thought she could hear the scrape of boots outside. Sometimes only the whisper of the wind. The men drifted into silence, caught in the kind of waiting that eroded courage grain by grain. Cruz broke it first. "You ever think about what you'll do after this?" The question hung heavy in the air. Emily lifted her eyes to him. His were shadowed, reflecting something raw. She could tell it wasn't casual curiosity. It was the voice of a man staring too long into the dark, trying to anchor himself with thoughts of a life beyond it. After, Kane snorted softly. "If there is an after." Cruz ignored him. He looked straight at Emily, as though her answer mattered more than his own. She hesitated. A dozen images flickered in her head. Her father's medals tucked away in a drawer, her mother's trembling hands as she had folded the flag at his funeral, the small hometown she had left behind because it was too full of ghosts. "I don't think about after," Emily said quietly. "Not anymore." Her voice was soft but sharp enough to cut the silence. Cruz blinked, almost wounded by it. Kane shook his head and muttered, "Figures." But Emily wasn't done. Her tone lowered, carrying something heavy. I used to. I used to plan, to imagine. But the truth is, every time I let myself dream of after, someone didn't make it there with me. And it felt like betrayal, so I stopped. The room fell still again. Cruz looked away, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. He didn't press her further. But his silence carried weight too, the weight of longing, of someone who still clung to after, even if it hurt. The hours dragged. Dawn crept closer. Shadows shifted into pale blue light, bleeding through the cracks of the ruined windows. Emily could feel the air change, thinner, colder. She knew the waiting couldn't last. The enemy had circled long enough. And then, like a clock striking, gunfire erupted outside. It was sudden, violent, a ripping storm of sound that shook the stone walls. Bullets cracked against the building. The door shuddered. Voices shouted in a language half swallowed by chaos. Emily's instincts roared to life. "Positions," she snapped, her voice slicing through the panic. Cruz rolled to the side window, pressing his rifle against the broken frame. Kane swung toward the door, his finger already on the trigger. Emily crouched low, her rifle steady, her eyes cold. The first wave hit like thunder. The door splintered under the force of a boot, fragments exploding inward. Kane fired instantly, the recoil jolting through him as the figure collapsed in the doorway. Another shadow lunged in behind him. Cruz fired, the shot echoing, blood spraying against the pale morning light. It wasn't enough, more came. Emily fired sharp, precise bursts, every shot controlled, every shot counted. The world became noise, shouts, gunfire, the sharp sting of smoke. The walls shook, dust fell from the ceiling. But underneath it all, her heartbeat was steady, her breath measured. She had been here before, too many times. Still, it was different now, because she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for something unspoken, something more fragile than life itself. The silent promise she had carried from the start. When the second wave fell, silence returned. It wasn't clean. The air stank of cordite and blood. The floor was littered with shadows that would never rise again. Cruz's cheek was grazed, a thin line of red tracing his skin. Kane's hands trembled as he reloaded, muttering curses under his breath. Emily stood in the middle of it, her rifle lowered, her eyes searching the doorway, waiting, listening. It wasn't over, she knew that. This was only the beginning. Because outside, beyond the smoke, more voices rose. The enemy wasn't broken. They were gathering, regrouping. And when they came again, it wouldn't just be to test. It would be to finish. Emily drew a long, quiet breath. Her eyes hardened. They had survived the night, but the day was only beginning. And she wondered, not for the first time, how much of herself she would have left to give before the sun finally set. The morning broke with fire. Not sunlight, gunfire. It started as distant cracks, sharp and rhythmic, carried on the wind like drums of war. Then closer, louder, until it rolled over the broken village like a tide of thunder. Emily rose from where she had crouched, muscles aching, mind sharp despite the exhaustion of the night. Cruz leaned against the window, scanning, his lips moving silently as he counted the flashes in the hills. Kane cursed, slamming another magazine into place, his face pale beneath the dirt. The enemy had come back, not probing this time, not testing. This was the storm. "Positions," Emily said, her voice low but steady. It wasn't a command barked out of panic. It was calm, certain, like gravity itself. Cruz moved to the side window, eyes narrowed. Kane covered the door again, though his hands trembled. Emily stayed near the center, steadying herself, her rifle at the ready. She knew this wasn't about surviving wave after wave. They couldn't. The numbers outside were too many. This was about holding long enough. Because somewhere out there, reinforcements were moving, or maybe they were. The radio had been too broken to confirm. Still, hope was a weapon too, and sometimes it was the only one left. The first explosion hit the outer wall, shaking dust from the ceiling. Shards of stone rained down. Cruz ducked, swearing under his breath. Kane flinched, his back pressed tighter to the wall. Emily steadied her breathing. "They'll breach," she murmured. "How many?" Kane asked, his voice cracking. Emily didn't answer. She knew the truth wouldn't help. The door rattled, boots thundered, shadows spilled like floodwater. And then it began. Gunfire tore through the building, echoing, deafening. Cruz fired, his shots quick, precise, cutting down figures as they surged. Kane screamed as he emptied his rifle, the recoil punishing, the sound unrelenting. Emily moved with cold precision, every squeeze of the trigger measured, every bullet placed with intention. But they were drowning. For every man that fell, another filled the doorway. For every silence, another shout. The air grew heavy with smoke and blood, the floor slick, the walls cracked. Cruz grunted, clutching his side. Emily glanced, saw the dark stain spreading across his uniform. But he didn't stop. He fired again, teeth bared, his voice hoarse with defiance. Kane's weapon jammed. He cursed, panicked, fumbling with trembling hands. Emily pivoted, covering him, her rifle barking in short bursts until he could clear the chamber. The room was chaos, and yet inside it Emily felt something strange, a stillness. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. The fear had burned away, leaving only fire in its place, quiet fire, the same kind that had carried her all this way. A figure lunged through the doorway. Emily's shot dropped him before his knife reached Kane's throat. Another vaulted the window. Cruz cut him down with a final burst before his strength faltered, his body sliding against the wall. "Cruz," Emily snapped, moving toward him. "I'm fine," he lied, his voice weak. Blood soaked his sleeve, his chest rising shallow. But his eyes begged her not to stop, not to waste the seconds he had left. Kane fired wildly, tears streaking through the dirt on his face. "We're not gonna make it," he shouted, his voice breaking. Emily grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back into cover. "We hold, you hear me? We hold." But inside she knew Kane was right. This was the last stand. Another explosion rocked the wall. The building groaned. Smoke poured in. Emily coughed, her lungs burning. Through the haze she saw shadows massing outside, dozens, maybe more. And in that moment, a memory struck her. Her father's voice. "You don't fight for glory, Emily. You fight for the one next to you, for the ground beneath your feet, for the promise you made the day you put on that uniform." She blinked back, the sting in her eyes. Her hand tightened on her rifle. A promise. That was what had brought her here, what had carried her through every doubt, every silence, every sacrifice. Not recognition, not medals, but the quiet vow to serve, to stand, to be the one who would not falter when others did. Even if it cost her everything. The doorway burst open again. The enemy surged. Emily rose, firing with precision, her body moving on instinct. Kane joined, his cries raw, desperate, but his shots true. Cruz, barely conscious, lifted his rifle one last time, his finger steady even as his body failed him. They pushed back the wave, somehow, barely. The floor was littered, the walls scarred. Silence followed, a heavy, suffocating silence. Emily's chest heaved, sweat stung her eyes, her hands trembled for the first time. Kane collapsed against the wall, sobbing quietly, his rifle clattering to the floor. Cruz slumped, pale, whispering something Emily couldn't hear. And then distant, a sound. Not enemy, not gunfire. Rotors. The low, thunderous beat of helicopter blades. Hope. Emily's head snapped upward. She stumbled toward the shattered window, peering into the smoke-streaked sky. And there, through the haze, a dark shape cut across the light. One, then another. Reinforcements. They had come. Kane laughed, the sound broken, unbelieving. Cruz's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile pulling at his lips. Emily exhaled, her body sagging with relief, but only for a moment. Because it wasn't over yet. The enemy knew. They surged again, desperate to finish what they had started before the helicopters could land. Gunfire sparked. Shadows closed in. Emily turned, her rifle lifting one final time. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She fired, covering the broken door, cutting down anyone who dared step through. Kane picked up his weapon again, screaming through his tears as he fought beside her. Cruz, fatting, still pulled the trigger when he could. The helicopters descended. Ropes dropped. Soldiers poured down, their shouts sharp, commanding like salvation itself. The enemy broke. Some fled, some fell. The tide turned in an instant, the storm swallowed by a greater force. And then silence. Real silence. Emily lowered her rifle, her hands trembling. Smoke curled in the air, lit by the pale morning sun. Cruz was carried out on a stretcher, still breathing. Kane was pulled to his feet, shaking, alive. She stood alone for a moment in the ruins, her chest rising, her eyes distant. No one cheered. No one clapped her on the back. The reinforcements swept through, efficient, controlled, already moving to secure the ground. But Emily didn't need recognition. She stepped forward, her boots crunching on broken stone. Her face was streaked with dirt and ash, her eyes hollow but fierce. She walked with quiet fire, her steps carrying the weight of the night, the lives held together by her resolve, the promise of service that burned even when the world threatened to smother it. And though no one spoke it, though no one saluted or called her name, the truth lingered in the air like smoke after battle. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Emily paused in the doorway, her shadow stretching across the floor. Then she walked into the morning light, silent, steady, unbroken. The mission was over, but her vow remained. And that was enough.